Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Andreas Umland. During the Ankara summit, Donald Trump made favorable comments on Ukraine's war effort against Russian invasion, even pledging a manufacturing license for highly sought-after Patriot missiles to be granted to Kiev. Shortly thereafter, reports emerged of a consensus actually appearing between the White House and the US Senate on tougher sanctions on Russia. Could the tides be turning against Putin on the diplomatic front, in addition to his battlefield failings? Joining us here today is Andreas Umland, Policy Fellow at the European Policy Institute in Kiev. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thanks for having me again.
So, when looking at the situation post-Ankara summit, can you see Ukraine's diplomatic standing improving compared to what we've seen during the last couple of months?
Yes, I think on the whole this was a good summit for Ukraine. What was bad, of course, was that in the declaration there was no mentioning of Ukraine's future membership in NATO. But maybe that is not so important at that point. What is more important is that there was this sort of pro-Ukrainian position of Trump at this summit. He made this promise about the Patriot missiles, but so far nothing has been signed. And in any way, it will probably last for a long time before this agreement about a license for Ukraine will actually lead to new Patriot missiles in Ukraine. But nevertheless, this was all in all a good summit, and the very presence of Zelensky there was, of course, important. And on the whole, there's now a different vibe, I would say, in the American-Ukrainian and also relations, and also in the relations between the European partners in NATO and Ukraine.
Now, briefly, because it has been discussed time and time again, but do you think that this lack of invitation for Ukraine to join NATO, is this simply a case of self-deterrence on the part of NATO members? Or is it more about practical issues such as Ukraine possibly, unfortunately, emerging from the war with some of its territories temporarily lost to Russia, of course, without any sort of formal recognition, but still territories that would have this contested status, legally belonging to Ukraine, Russia occupying them. So basically NATO members thinking, wouldn't that situation automatically trigger a rather problematic position for NATO from the Article 5 standpoint, obviously?
This is a problem of Ukraine as long as these territories are not under Ukrainian control, but one can take different positions on that. One can, in a treaty, in an accession treaty for NATO, one could sort of take care of this. The same, by the way, goes for Georgia, which was actually a country that was more ahead on the path to NATO than Ukraine. Currently, the situation in Georgia has, of course, changed, but for Georgia also there would be this issue about Abkhazia and the Tskhinvali region, and different national governments have taken different positions on that. The absence of this, of the sort of confirmation of the promise of NATO membership for Ukraine is, I guess, mainly now a function of perhaps future diplomatic efforts to reach a ceasefire and not to trigger with such a reconfirmation of this future membership of NATO in a NATO declaration. Russia. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on this, because Ukraine is simply now by the year becoming more and more interesting for NATO, and there are even voices now in Western Europe that say, well, the US is not any longer a strong, reliable partner for the European countries, so we need a replacement, and partly Ukraine could actually replace the US in as being a powerful military partner of the current European NATO member countries. So I wouldn't put too much negative interpretation into this absence of such a sentence in the final declaration.
Isn't this view slightly controversial? Not insofar as Ukraine would be a valuable ally, because it obviously would be, but insofar as anyone being able to replace the United States when it comes to certain capabilities, such as, of course, the nuclear umbrella, but also sophisticated long-range weapon, stealth fighters, or the naval power projection across the world. None other country actually has these capabilities at this stage.
Yes, surely in the areas that you just mentioned, Ukraine would not be able to replace the US. But it is the country now that has the capability to fight Russia. It has a lot of experience, a lot of technological innovation. And right now, in the last weeks, it seems as if Ukraine has finally found actually a weak point in the functioning of the Russian state, the Russian economy, and it looks now as if the current situation is actually the current time is working on for Ukraine. Earlier on, a few months before, I would have said the time is working against Ukraine, because in this war of attrition, it looked as if Russia has the larger resources. But now Ukraine has found this possibility to reduce radically certain resources of Russia and to cause actually a wider economic and social crisis in Russia. And that is a capability also that is, of course, the capability to do that is something that is valuable for NATO as well.
But don't you think that, although, of course, Ukraine has become a formidable fighting force, is scoring major victories against Russia, but shouldn't Ukraine's allies be wary of becoming complacent? This is something that former Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny recently mentioned. He said, even though Ukraine is doing really well, European allies should not assume that Russia is losing. Not yet. Do you think there is a risk that some countries might say, oh, Ukraine is doing so well, it's got great weapons, great capabilities, we don't need to provide it with more aid, because that potentially could be catastrophic?
Yes, that would be, of course, a wrong conclusion. And in spite of these impressive successes that Ukraine has had in the last weeks, and these are not only nice pictures from Russia, these explosions, they also have material consequences for Russia. In spite of all of this, of course, Ukraine still needs a lot of support, and there is a sort of Russian counter-strategy to simply bombard civilian infrastructure in Ukraine in order to cause a panic or frustration and depression in Ukraine, and to motivate thereby perhaps the Ukrainian leadership to fulfill Russia's conditions for a ceasefire. And I've just returned from Kiev, and I've been through two of these large bombardments with many victims of Kiev, and this is, of course, a very sad and dangerous moment for Ukraine as well. On the other hand, Kiev and other Ukrainian cities, even more so, have gone through these horrible bombardments many times before in the last more than 4 years. So there's nothing really new here. The only novelness of this Russian approach is that now Kiev seems to be the main target. Earlier, other cities, especially in eastern and southern Ukraine, have been bombarded more heavily than Kiev.
So it is essentially a story of the unbroken Ukrainian fighting spirit. But do Ukraine's allies have anything comparable to this fighting spirit? I'm asking because time and time again there are signals that right now is the time to begin talking to Russia. There have been some comments from various circles, political but also financial, about the need to consider returning to Russian energy. We've had these comments, of course, from the German far right, but also from a certain member of the business community, a very prominent one, a while ago. Do you think the risk is that right now Russia will begin a very intense offensive on the diplomatic and disinformation front to try once again to sow unrest and disunity, saying that on the battlefield Putin's army is clearly not doing very well?
Certainly, Russia will do so, and the Western position should be very simple, that Russia should withdraw all of its troops that it has illegally in other countries, not only in Ukraine, but also in Moldova and in Georgia, and it should revise its foreign policy. And if it credibly goes away from its expansionist aims, then perhaps one could have indeed a reset of the relations. But anything else would be very stupid against, especially the background of the experience of the last 4 years to renew this relationship and then basically allow Russia to recover from the current Ukrainian campaign against its energy infrastructure. And then we would be back to square one and Russia would start again a war, maybe not only against Ukraine, but also against the NATO member countries.
So do you think it's, there is enough decisiveness and enough resilience to completely cut off our economies from the Russian energy resources? I'm asking because, of course, the United States is going to have a new set of tools with the sanctions legislation coming in. There is a consensus apparently between Congress and President Trump. But this is against the background, of course, the Middle East, the constant crisis concerning the Strait of Hormuz, but also European countries still buying Russian LNG, still buying Russian uranium. Do you think that societies in Europe and beyond are prepared for some hardships in order to achieve these geopolitical goals for the future?
Frankly, I don't know. I have also my doubts, and I think there has to be still Ukraine and its friends to be done a lot of education about the nature of the Russian state, that basically the Russian state came out of the breakup of the Soviet Empire as a rump empire, still being an empire, still ruling many territories that did not belong to the sort of the core territory of the ethnic Russians a few hundred years ago. And so this smaller Russian imperial states as imperialism and ideas of expansion and revision and revanche, and that is simply not acknowledged in many countries. They think Russia is just a large country, but otherwise like any other country, not realizing that Russia is still an imperial country. The other imperial countries, they have shrunk to their original territories of their titular nations of these empires and have thus become nation states. But Russia has not become a proper nation state, and that has to be made clear. And then I think all the other questions would follow from then about foreign economic policies, foreign security policies, once such an understanding is reached and a proper assessment of the nature of the Russian state is spread widely.
Andreas Umland was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thanks for having me again.
And I'm Milan Szerwiński. You're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news and updates.